Almost 4 months into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the country is still standing, in no part thanks to the help of Western allies, as 70 countries have provided some sort of aid to Ukraine, as well as group blocs like the European Union and Western companies such as Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. Yesterday, Joe Biden pledged another $1 billion in military aid to Ukraine, and earlier today, several European leaders met with Zelensky in Kiev for the first time since the beginning of the war. But despite all this, there are still fears that this is not enough. There are worries across the country that declining media coverage will lead to a dip in support. Many countries, including Israel, have been accused of not providing enough military support, as Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said that aid is still not going far enough. But has the West exhausted all their other options now? Is their support going to decline as the war is pushed out of the media cycle? Is the West doing enough to help Ukraine?
So let's get to it. Is the West doing enough to help Ukraine? Dear lady and gentlemen, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. So Mr. Dupuy, please take the lead.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the visit of the 4 and not 3, because there was both Mr. Macron for France, still President of the Council of the European Union, Olaf Scholz, President of the G7 Chancellor, German Chancellor, Mario Draghi, and the Romanian President Klaus Iohannis was there as well. So I'm not sure that the visit was angled for the end of the war. It was mostly a diplomatic visit, and it was mostly a symbolic visit to show or to showcase the ongoing political support, as we are speaking a few minutes ago, ended the press conference of the 5 leaders with President Volodymyr Zelensky, and they all agreed on the fact that that Ukraine must be granted immediate candidacy status for the European Union.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Dupuy. We'll get to all of that in a second. Dr. Shelest, your take?
You know, from your introduction, you said, is it time for diplomacy or what Ukraine needs? The time for diplomacy we had in December last year. And now definitely Ukraine also needs weaponry. And that's what is really important. And what we heard during this visit is the continuation of the military support for Ukraine in addition to the diplomatic. And the Ramstein 3 meeting that we had yesterday was quite a probably proof that the West is not tired. And now probably we would have additional support from the countries like Germany that previously been hesitating. And this visit is quite an interesting, even the delayed. But now let's see those promises, how they will be implemented.
Yes, and we'll unpack it all in a second. Last but definitely not least, Mr. Klain, your take?
Is the West doing enough to help Ukraine? The short answer is not yet. Ukraine needs more weapons. What we're providing so far has, of course, been tremendous. More military aid has gone to Ukraine than any country in recent memory, but they need more, especially if our goal is to make sure that Ukraine wins this war and expels all of the Russian invaders and retakes its territory. What we've given now is enough to hold off the Russian advance, but not enough for a full victory. So Ukraine needs more.
And on that note, we will start the debate part of the debate. So please feel free to interact with one another, dear panelists, from this point onwards. I would like to ask you questions from the sidelines of the events on the ground today. A report that I find truly fascinating about the scope and scale of the lack of accurate intelligence on behalf of the Kremlin. Official documents obtained by CNN revealed that Putin believed on the eve of the war that it will take him no more than 12 hours to conquer Kyiv, 3 days for President Zelensky to get out of the area. Help me mend the gaps between the reality on the ground and what the Russian intelligence had to say, Mr. Klain.
Sure. So I think that the best analogy here is that Putin, obviously his assumptions were squarely wrong. What he probably expected is something more similar to what we saw in Afghanistan late last year. The Taliban swept across the country quite rapidly, and the Afghan government abandoned the country and fled. That's probably what Putin was expecting here, and from these intelligence reports, that seems to be the indication. Clearly, though, that is not what happened. President Zelensky stayed. The Ukrainian people have put up an incredible fight, and Putin's assumptions have been squarely wrong. He got Ukraine wrong.
And yeah, that's for sure. Perhaps the biggest underestimation of the century when it comes to the Ukrainian people's resistance. So let's go back to what is currently unfolding. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov is saying that the U.S. and Russia at a very, very hot spot of the conflict. Dr. Shelest, is it just a war of attrition of sort, or are there more bargaining chips from Moscow's standpoint?
That is definitely not a bargaining. Each bargaining that you're hearing, they are predominantly for the picture, for the show, rather than for the reality. Because as for now, from all the Russian statements, you can hear it very clearly that the main goal is to destruct Ukraine and to eliminate Ukraine as a nation. At the same time, from Ukraine, it is the war of survival. It is the war of independence, even what we didn't have 30 years ago. That's why we are talking about the existential things. We are not talking about some river or some town that we are going to bargain. When Ukraine is speaking about liberation of the territories, we are speaking not just about the territories. We are speaking about the people who made their choice, who belong to the Ukrainian nation. And that is, by the way, the question to the previous about the Putin underestimation. The situation is quite clear. On the one hand, he is definitely overestimated the power of his armed forces, that being extremely corrupted, so not prepared. But at the same time, the intelligence that he received very often being from the proxies that he had, the agent that he had in the Ukrainian territories. And for the last 8 years, we had a lot of investigations proving that most of the money, and that is billions of rubles being spent for these, for propaganda, for some covert operations, they've been just stolen and wasted. So the data that he's been receiving, especially about towns like Odessa, for example, or Kharkiv, being completely inadequate comparing to what's being on the ground with the pro-Russian sentiments.
Yes, and Mr. Dupuy, first of all, I stand corrected for European leaders indeed, but either way you look at it, a high-profile visit with sending a very strong message of unity. But one speculation that it is also perhaps has to do with the pending Ukrainian EU bid. Can the EU really say no at this point in time, considering everything that's happening?
Well, I think the question is not saying no, but when. I think everyone is agreeing that on the fact that Ukraine has a European destiny. There was a poll, and almost 90% of the Ukrainians who were interrogated mentioned the fact that their destiny was in Europe. And the poll was as high in the eastern part and as in the western part, which is traditionally more Euro-focused on behalf of geography, on behalf of language, and on behalf of the proximity of already EU and NATO members. I think the question is, on what basis must Ukraine enter Europe? Entering Europe is not only a gift which is given or would be given for the high price that Ukraine has paid for its independence and its defending of its territory. Entering the European Union, or at least this was the case during the last 70 years, takes time. It takes an agenda. It is called in French, I will say it in French, l'acquis communautaire, the communitarian perspective. It takes more or less 300 pages of norms, of laws, of decision it's a trajectory. Yeah. It takes 35 chapters to be in capability of entering the norms of the European Union. So it's not whether or not we want entering Ukraine, it's whether or not Ukraine in a long time period, maybe 5, 6, maybe 10 years, will be in capacity to do it. Again, entering the entrance of the Ukraine in the European Union will not put an end to the war. It's not that question at all. There's two agendas. There is the defense agenda, which was already mentioned in the Ramstein base in Germany, under the auspices of Lloyd Austin and the American Chief of Staff, Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley. And of course, it was about having more weapons, better weapons, and of course, more rapidly brought to the Ukrainian territory. There was a clear dedication. The contract group on the armament of Ukraine fulfilled its commitment. $1 billion more of dollars for that perspective. Yes. A certain number of shells, more or less 35,000 shells, more high intensity, high mobility rocket system, launch rocket system, IMARS, etc., etc. So it's about the capacity to fulfill this dedication on a long run. This is true both on the military and on the diplomatic agenda.
And if I understand that correctly, Mr. Dupuy, there's no intention to bend the rules, so to speak, even when the war is raging, which is understandable. But
maybe I can pinpoint on that for one very rapidly, for one obvious reason. What are we going to say to Albania, who has been in a candidate
making
status
an exception has a ripple effect
since 2009, or North Macedonia 2004. Even Turkey is a candidate since 1987.
Right, absolutely. Again, making an exception creates a ripple effect, even though reality happens now. And Mr. Klain, if the EU bid moves forward in some form or capacity, how will it impact the current dynamics vis-a-vis Russia?
Sure. So we did have one big piece of news today from the visit of 4 European leaders to Ukraine. They all signaled their support for Ukraine receiving candidacy for EU membership. As our speaker in Paris mentioned, obviously Ukraine trying to join the European Union, it could take quite a long time, and there's a lot that comes along with that. And even if Ukraine was a member of the EU, that would not immediately solve the problem of this war. But it does matter because Ukraine, being closer integrated with Europe and getting closer support from the rest of Europe, that's something that can help Ukraine to have better support in terms of weapons, economics, energy, and it creates a stronger united front against Russia's aggression. So it's only good for Ukraine to become better integrated with the rest of Europe. And it's something that Ukrainians for years have said. The reason why this war is happening in the first place is because Putin, A, does not see Ukraine as a real country, and B, because Ukrainians have said that they want to follow their own path. They want to determine their own future. And in this case, they see their future as not being with Russia. They see it with Europe.
Right. And Dr. Shelest, we're out for a short break in a second. So very briefly, your take on that?
Very briefly, because there were few misleadings. Ukraine is not asking for the gift, and Ukraine is not asking now for the membership, but for the candidacy status. Right. So we are not bypassing any rules. That's first of all. The second, we signed the association agreement 8 years ago, and we've been actively working for the reforms. So we are taking the same as the Balkans. The question is how well we will be able to do it, and we are definitely not seeing European Union membership as the way to solve the conflict.